Well, welcome everyone to this next edition of 30 Minutes with a Hacker, where we share insights on cybersecurity from hackers' perspective. My name is Jade Whitty. I'm in the Security Solutions Group at Tech Data, and with me here today and each month when we do these calls are Brett Scott and Josh Harp, two ethical hackers who are in the trenches every day assisting a number of key departments within the U.S. government against nation-state attackers. Their jobs just happen to also be working for Tech Data, helping our partners fight the bad guys, running the Arizona Cyber Warfare Range, and building out the new Tech Data Cyber Range, which is currently in the works. So why Tech Data when these guys could work anywhere? Well, besides being a great place to work, as most of you know, there is a cybersecurity crisis right now in this country. There's a massive shortage of qualified cybersecurity professionals to fight out not just the individual bad guys, but more importantly, nation-state attackers from foreign countries. And check out cyberseek.org, cyber is SEEK.org, to get an update on the shortage of cybersecurity professionals. So it's very real. So working for Tech Data and educating our approximately 8,000 security partners who are implementing security solutions to protect organizations enables Brett and Josh to have a larger impact in fighting the fight. So we're truly lucky to have them, and their sincerity in truly making a difference and their willingness to share their insights to elevate everyone's game is much appreciated. Today's topic is privacy. So privacy is going to be one of the biggest topics throughout the rest of this year and next. There's articles coming out all the time. Most of us are familiar with what happened recently with Facebook and saw Zuckerberg's testimony with Congress. So how do privacy concerns impact our businesses? As we know, privacy goes hand in hand with security, and to talk more about that, I'm going to turn this over to Josh Harp to set the table for this discussion. So Josh?
Yeah, thanks, Jade, for the introduction. So as Jade had mentioned, privacy is going to be a hot topic going into this year. A lot of what we have seen, especially in relation to some of the bigger technology orgs testifying in front of Congress, is just the general concern, especially in the United States, around users and our data. When it comes to any product that's free online, you're giving something up when you utilize that product in the form of personal information. And for a lot of people, that personal information and how it's secured and how it's dealt with and the way it's leveraged by an organization is now only, even though it should have been, coming to the forefront of people's minds. And the reason for that is because, let's face it, when an adversary or a hacker is getting into your network, they're going after the data that you have, that is the cash money for them. So what you saw, if you looked at any of the congressional hearings and when there were pinpointed questions directly to the leaders of this organization and what they were doing to, one, secure user information, and two, what they were doing with it, there wasn't direct response. There was follow-up, like, we'll get back to you with that. But the reason for that, and we could probably deliberate why, is because it's going directly after their financial model, right? So if we try and constrict and restrain the type of data they're collecting on their users, and users are wanting more privacy, they're ultimately going to be losing money from that. So that is one of the areas in relation to general user privacy outside of typical organizational structures, and is more focused on end users. But I'm sure Brett may have some examples for direct business impact for partners and customers.
Yeah, so privacy is a very big deal. It has been a big deal for a few years in several other countries. For example, our neighbors to the north, they now have a thing called PIPEDA, P-I-P-E-D-A, and it has to do with the protection and securing of personal data. And they also make it essentially impossible for foreign countries to gain access to or leverage PII data, privacy data, outside of Canada. So that's to the north. Over in Europe, in May of last year, there was GDPR, General Data Privacy Regulations. That took effect in May, And interestingly enough, there was a study that was just released that said that a lot of European companies also have not actually complied with their own set of rules. But GDPR essentially allows for things like a customer has a right to be forgotten, but most importantly to your customers, your end customers. They can go to the end customer and say, what do you know about me? And if you don't respond to that in a certain period of time, they can fine you for failure to provide the data requested in that request. So it is something that it will continue to greatly impede American business, especially if you're doing any form of business with European citizens. But then we have a law that's about to take place in January, which is called CCPA, California Consumer Protection Act. And that is going to be essentially a GDPR light, but for Californians. Several other states are also passing these laws, and so Facebook and Google and all these guys, they're throwing up their hands saying, wait a minute, we can't have all these different laws with different rules, different regulations. We need you guys to homogenize this. There needs to be one US federal law for privacy. So privacy is going to be on the tongue of everybody. It is a very big deal. An incredible amount of energy is being put into that, and there will also be a big battle as far as how data needs to be protected, how much of the fines, etc. So those are some significant drivers, but now that it's moved to legislation, it's something that you cannot ignore. And for example, in the case of CCPA, if your people cannot articulate to an inspector or a regulator exactly what processes you follow related to data, you get fined for your people not being fully versed on that. So the time to act is now, because by come January 1, you could have a regulator knock on your door and you could be held liable and fined for failure to prepare.
So talk a little bit about, we heard about how it affects the PETA, GDPR, CCPA that's coming up. What about emergency response and other federal regulations in addition?
Well, like I said, right now it's a very chaotic environment, but the one thing that is clear is that American businesses now have to be able to speak the language of privacy, and they need to have a plan that they can articulate on how they are protecting their users' data and what they do in the cases of breaches. Again, FTC has made it absolutely clear, if you are not first to let people know that something bad has happened, if you do not proactively engage and tackle that, they will fine the living heck out of you. And so because privacy is essentially antithetical to the business model of American business, we are in for a bit of a ride. It's going to be a big challenge for most of us.
There's a trend right now towards consolidation or centralizing identity and access management. Talk a little bit about that and how it relates to privacy and what we're seeing the trend happening.
Yeah, so there are some interesting ideas that are out there. Identity and access management hasn't really been updated in the last 40 years. So there are several innovators that are entering the space. The idea of consolidation essentially centralize all of your PII data for your people. And what that means is bad guys can really only get it from this place that you've made, which kind of gives you, in military terms, that's a kind of a choke point. You can just put a lot of people watching that and say, hey, whoever is trying to do something bad with this, they're after our most important stuff, and so therefore we must stop them as quickly as possible. So consolidation should reduce costs. It will definitely reduce liability. And most importantly, it gives you a better opportunity to put stronger defenses around one of the things that most everybody wants.
So it'll increase your ability to defend against adversaries who are going after your most critical infrastructure in terms of data and what you're holding on to. Correct.
I'm wondering if we can dive.
So, like an example of this could be, right? There was an embassy. I believe it was in one of the South American countries. It was an embassy from Mexico, and the embassy servers had been compromised, and the adversary had found scans of passports, scans of birth certificates, scans of death certificates, all sorts of data that it can be classified in the U.S. under PII. And there is rumor, so to speak, that the adversary attempted to extort the embassy in the form of a bounty. So I hacked into your server, I won't tell anyone how I did it, and I won't release the data to the public if you give me some money, right? When they didn't respond, the individual made available to anyone with an internet connection the ability to download this data. So now how does that affect the Mexican citizens that visited that embassy? They now are more likely susceptible, depending upon who the adversary spreaded the data to, who downloaded it, to identity theft.
Massive identity theft. The kind that's very hard to root back out again because they have all the critical papers, so they can establish very strong identity replacement, if you will.
I'm curious how other countries are looking at privacy. I mean, we see with GDPR, if you're doing business in Europe, you know, the requirements there. But I'm curious other countries and the impact of them implementing privacy policies or not, you know, how that impacts us in this country. Curious to get your take.
Yeah, so every country is doing something like this. Most countries realize that because it's going to be so disruptive to American business, it kind of creates a new opportunity, if you will, because essentially we're trying to run the marathon with a 20-pound pack that was put on us related to privacy and changing how we do things. So there's now an opportunity for a bunch of emerging economies to declare their own set of rules and then use them both as an advantage in business, but also to do something very popular with their citizens, which is protect their data.
Okay. You know, let's talk a little bit more about PII and what constitutes it specifically. And I know that there's some debate of what really constitutes it, like log data, for instance. There's certain requirements from a HIPAA perspective, and you've got to retain information for a certain period of time. But a lot of people feel like, well, the log data from, let's say, that a SIM is collecting is not necessary to be stored. I'd like to talk through that a little bit, and you guys share what you're hearing, the misconceptions, and what's accurate on that.
Absolutely. So that when someone says my log data does not contain PII, that is completely false. Almost universally, every one of the privacy laws that are out there will take several elements that are in those logs and classify that as PII. Believe it or not, IP addresses, usernames, machine names, all of those things can be used to identify someone, and because of that, they're considered PII. So the act of doing just what you did before and without any changes, you now have a rogue set of PII data out there, and if you don't protect it like it's PII, if something bad happens with it, you get fined to oblivion. And that is something that is the stick that is going to force us to do everything different. One of the things that we at Tech Data did was we brought on a company called Fluency Security. Fluency Security allows you to abstract all the PII data into monikers, and therefore simply swap out and replace. You are instantaneously compliant with non-PII based logging, and there are some other benefits that go along with it, 40% reduction in costs, et cetera, but we did that because none of our other vendors had an answer to the question of, now that I have this PII problem with my logs, how do I do that? How do I protect myself from these regulators? So at the moment, I believe that Fluency is still the only entity that allows you to completely substitute the PII data with a moniker so that you can still use it as a log, but it's not considered PII.
And they bridge the ability, right, to go back in time to old logs you're retaining and do that elimination of PII, which would be a big struggle for a lot of organizations now who have data retention policies to be able to go back and remove all this PII from their logging.
Imagine the cost that your customers will be bearing having to go back through all of their logs and all of the backups and redoing them all so that they don't look like they violate the PII rules.
Interesting. So, I don't know if there's more to talk about on that specific topic, but I'd be curious what you feel, when I say that topic, I mean specifically around PII, but let's dive a little bit more into some advice we can give partners on the baseline steps that you should be taking in securing privacy within the companies that you're servicing. There's a number of things that need to be really looked at from a baseline perspective. And so from a hacker perspective, I'd love for you guys to share what you feel is the most critical areas to really look at.
Well, first, I think a lot of organizations need to level set and understanding what they're actually logging. One of the defensive tactics that is always told to new security engineers or new SOC analysts is we need to log all the things so we can be able to identify what's going on, which is accurate to a point, but you need to have some tuning involved to be able to make sure that you're not just receiving a whole bunch of noise. So knowing what you're logging, how you're logging it is most important. Because if you're saying, yeah, we're logging, but you don't know exactly what it is you're keeping track of, then do you really have insight into the crucial data that's there or what's going on?
Plus, if you're logging it and no one's looking at it, why are you logging it? I mean, if you literally are not going to ever look at these things, data bits don't have a personality. They don't ever get lonely. So there's no point in creating them if there's nobody who's ever going to look at them. So I would say to you that obviously you want to have a good, well-regulated logging regime that will help your people ascertain what may or may not have happened. If a regulator comes calling, if you say, I'm not sure what happened, we think something bad happened, they literally are going to tell you, get your checkbook out, you're about to pay an awful lot of money for not knowing something as basic as what happened to you. So logging is there and necessary. Something like a SIM or at least a service, like a SOC service, MSSP. We have a thing called Recon SOC, where there are educated people who will watch your logs on your network for you and then alert you to when they see problems. So having the logs in the first place, having people who know what they're doing, looking at those logs and then alerting you when there are problems is out of the box. That is a minimal requirement for anything. And if you don't, there are now a lot of daggers out there that will harm you for failure to do that. After you get to that, the one thing that you hear about almost every single time is the thing that got breached was fixed by a patch. So it is very easy to eliminate a lot of threats to your organization if you have a regular process for patching and updating all of your systems. That includes, for example, things like IoT for some of those folks that are using those kind of things, firmware and devices, equipment, all of those things should be maintained and updated. So a strong patching regime is extremely useful. Lots of tools out there will do it. And if you don't, all you're doing is leaving your windows open so that anybody who chances by that can walk right in. And by the way, it doesn't have to be a person. A lot of the nation states out there, they have automated systems that will go and just check all the doors and see, what's open here, what's here. If you have something that's out there that hasn't been patched, they can find it and go, oh, look, here's this wonderful thing I just found randomly on the internet. Here you go, guys, have fun with this. So logging, SIM, and people who are intelligent watching that SIM, patching your system so that when the vendor updates something, you can remove that from the risks to your organization. Ironically enough, one of the reasons why companies don't patch is they're afraid they might break something. That's kind of like saying, I don't want to wear a parachute because it might wrinkle my suit. If you're going to be thrown out of the airplane, you definitely don't care about your suit, right? So it's really important that you have those patches and updates up there. If something breaks, are we professionals or not? Do you hire IT people? Do your partners hire IT people? Let them fix it. The minimal disruption you may encounter is absolutely negligible compared to the risk that you're taking on if you don't patch. And then finally, the last little piece of all of this, you probably want to monitor your file systems. So endpoint security does a lot of that kind of thing. But if someone comes in and changes, say, a web page on your servers, and now that web page is distributing malware, almost nobody's going to ever know that you're the ones doing it. And even if somebody calls you and says there's a problem, your people will look all through everything and never see this thing, this piece of malware that's being distributed off your own web servers. So having a file system would let you know, hey, our homepage just changed. And then one of your IT people can say, wait a minute, nobody's changing our webpage. What happened? And all of a sudden now you know, hey, something bad is happening that I need to fix, and here's specifically where that thing is. So those are 3 things you could be doing right now, baseline stuff, that are absolutely essential. Obviously, I'm assuming that they've got endpoint management, you've got some kind of antivirus, anti-malware, and then so there's a lot of chaos in that space right now, recently created for us by our good friends over in Russia. And so as a direct result, I'm assuming you have at least a solid endpoint management, antivirus, anti-malware running. If not, add that to the list.
What about like DNS and access control heuristics and that type of thing? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's especially when you're dealing with threat hunting and other types of malware risks. Let's face it, Tech Data has 15,000 employees. We know that there are 8 of them that, even though they've been through the anti-malware and anti-phishing training and all that stuff, they'll click on any link that you send them. So because of that, bad things are going to happen because you have users. Those users are going to make mistakes. How do you then detect that they've made that mistake and remediate the problem quickly? One of the easiest ways to do that is to use a DNS monitoring solution. So you can say, hey, wait a minute, this workstation here is calling out to some place we know is a bad place. Here's the specific workstation that's doing it, and here are the times it's happened. So that allows you to quickly detect that a breach has occurred on your network, which very often, if you catch it fast enough, turns out to be nothing more than a slight hassle for your IT department versus a breach where you are losing money.
Sounds good. What about protecting your data that's in the cloud? Because everything's moving that direction. What are some of the steps that are critical if you've got information on the cloud?
So if you already have a hard time monitoring your own servers inside your building, now imagine you have servers that nobody ever looks at that are in a data center, you're not even sure where it is. You need solutions out there that are going to alert you to things that are going on in those cloud spaces. I can tell you right now, if you spin up a new VM on a very popular cloud hosting service, within a minute, it will start getting scanned and attacks will go against it. And this is quite literally something you've just created. More often than not now, you cannot install the security to defend yourself against that before that stuff starts attacking. So you're now playing Russian roulette for how quickly can you get your security solutions in place right after you spin up that service. So major risk out there, things like CASB solutions, and again, the same types of trips there, like looking at your file system, making sure that you have some kind of endpoint security, you have people who are watching your logs, etc. All of those things apply, but they apply even more so because cloud providers are giant rooms or buildings full of compute and data and all those things. So all of the bad guys focus on those cloud-hosted environments because it's an easier place to get wins.
Because in a cloud-hosted infrastructure, right, your organization doesn't necessarily need to be the weak link. It's identifying another weak link in the same infrastructure or in the same cloud provider's environment where you potentially also have services and making a lateral pivot to your own.
That's exactly right.
So, I mean, I think a lot of people would state that, let's say Amazon or Microsoft, they're hiring some of the the top people in, let's say, cybersecurity to help protect that infrastructure. So what's the gap there? The misconception is, well, if I'm putting it on the cloud, it's going to be secure, but there's a major thing that's being missed there. And just to talk about that as far as how you're actually able to protect that data, like in transit, at rest, that type of thing.
Yeah, actually, it's a very bad misnomer when people think, oh, I'm going to put it in the cloud, it's secure, they have security people. They are very clear and they're spelling out, we don't do anything to secure your cloud instance. We keep ourselves up and running, which is the security that we do. Yeah. But as far as us being up and running, what's running in there and how vulnerable it is, they don't even touch, not even close with a 10-foot pole. They will sell you services But when you really start looking at the contracts of those services, the services also do not say, we are protecting your stuff. They're like, we're going to make an attempt to protect your stuff. Hopefully the tool that you're using works. Otherwise, you're kind of out of luck. So most cloud services are completely vulnerable because the assumption is this thing will be more secure because other people are monitoring.
It's like when you buy a bicycle, right? They're not also throwing in or selling you a helmet along with that bicycle. You have to go out and figure out what helmet's right for you and implement wearing that helmet when you ride your bike. Most cloud providers, when it comes to a security solution, they have offerings that they'll give to you at a cost, right? Or they provide guidance in how you can go about securing your own data in the cloud. I would say who's the fall guy? Like if your infrastructure gets compromised in the cloud, if it was a vulnerability within the software-defined networking or in the way the cloud provider provides hosting, sure, they're the fall guy. But if because you implemented or you developed a vulnerable application that's now running, or you have an unpatched system, right? SharePoint's a big thing right now. A lot of adversaries have pivoted to exploiting a SharePoint vulnerability that has a patch for it, and are dropping a China-based web shell onto it. That when that happens, the cloud provider isn't the fall guy. It's you who didn't update your SharePoint server in the cloud, right?
And if your SharePoint server gets compromised and then they use that as a pivot to attack other customers, your vendor in the form of the cloud hosting provider becomes your enemy because they're now siding with the other customers that they have and saying, you failed to protect the thing that you were running on our networks, and now we're going to hold you liable for that.
Talk about the role that encryption plays in all of this, and when you're going to see it, when it's going to be most advantageous.
Yeah, so encryption is a nice tool. It helps to protect you from the lowest echelons of the attackers. It is in and of itself not the answer. It's not a permanency. There's no real gain other than the fact that you just remove a large number of attackers from the playing field. So that is its value. You want to encrypt at rest. You want to encrypt in transit, and not only when you're transferring data. And then, of course, you want to make sure that that too is maintained and updated and so forth and so on. Not surprisingly, bad guys go after encryption too, and many of the encryptions that are still in use today are completely vulnerable. And so now you're simply paying a penalty in performance, gaining nothing in security, and you just made your life more difficult, and you're still as vulnerable as you are.
It's like it's when, if you think of how's an adversary going to go after my encryption? Well, they may not try and break the encryption. They may not try to leverage a skeleton key or anything like that. One of the things they may do, right, is go after your user. And if they can compromise the user and find where the user is storing backup keys, or where the user is storing passwords, or things of that nature, which now are leveraged legitimately to help you gain access to the data you need, they can defeat your encryption through that method. So when most people think about defeating encryption, they think about it at the layer of encryption itself, the type of encryption that's being used, and the fact that it can't easily be broken. And if it can be broken, it could take much more time. But in the sense of data that is encrypted with a key, a private key, in most situations, what it is you have instances where who was that? There was a chat provider whose development web servers got compromised through a Jenkins-based vulnerability. And what the adversary found was that the developers were holding their private keys and encryption keys on the dev servers. So that means through leveraging an exploit for a known vulnerability that had a patch in a Jenkins server, they were now able to defeat signing and encryption of their software because of where they had stored the keys. I mean, so they don't have to go after the encryption itself. They can just go again against you, the user, in a way in which you're potentially insecure, not properly storing the keys.
Yeah, and of course, adding to the complexity, if they are able to compromise your encryption keys, it actually makes it more difficult for your security team to even detect something bad has happened because it's encrypted. Most security tools cannot decrypt things.
And that is what directly plays into the conversation we had last time on 30 Minutes with a Hacker, where we talked about supply chain-based attacks and how adversaries are gaining access to code signing keys, and they're not compromising it in the sense of trying to break the key itself. They're leveraging that key to sign illegitimate code to make it appear legitimate when it's on a user's desktop or when it's scanned by an antivirus or through heuristics or anything like that. It looks as though, because everything, all trust right now has been established through a key. So who's to say that if, let's say, Brett had encryption keys and I had encryption keys, and one day I wanted to take Brett's encryption keys and I signed something as though I was Brett, most people would say, well, that's Brett because his key matches up. There's no additional measure or means to identify individuals beyond that.
Yeah, we're over-trusting a security system in that case.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're at the 30-minute mark, and so I don't know if you guys have anything you want to say just to kind of sum up or wrap this up, or if we want to just conclude. Anything that you want to state?
Privacy
to wrap
is
this?
a real deal. You absolutely must take this seriously. You need to be getting on top of it now. This year is wasting away, and come January 1, there are a whole new set of laws that directly apply to you that you will be held accountable and fined for failure to address. You must get on top of this immediately.
And something people may want to start doing in their own time is just see what has been indexed about you by Google. Just see what's out there about you. Put your name, put your first and last name, even middle initial into Google, and see what information has been currently indexed about you. And you'll begin to realize how important it is that organizations and even us as users start to realize our privacy, how important it is.
And our lack of protecting our data has made us all much more vulnerable than we should.
Is there any way, speaking of that Google search for your name, is there any way without paying for a provider to do it, to search the dark web for your name safely?
You know, what's kind of interesting is there are a lot of folks out there that says, oh, we'll search the darknet for you. Well, it's kind of like they're assuming that darknet is a Walmart-like entity. There is no place individually that do that. We have partnered with an organization, a couple of organizations that will assist with detecting and notifying you when you're being brought up or your people are being brought up. But by the same token, they also have a limited view of everything that's going on. I would say to you that I don't think that an Experian will do that for you.
Yeah. It's quite funny that the credit scoring agency started to offer dark web scanning services once a whole bunch of them started getting popped. My recommendation would be go to a resource like Have I Been Pwned, which you can search your own email address to see if it's been identified in a breach. And when you found your email address, you should be able to determine where it is you've used that email before. And let's just go so far to say that, you know, if you've used that email on a platform where you've probably put in PII or anything like that, if you're reusing credentials, there's a possibility that social security numbers, things like that, have been compromised. I wouldn't go so far as to say start worrying about it. But you can start to be able to identify different areas where information about you has potentially leaked out in the form of email, in the form of creds. Sometimes on Have I Been Pwned, it will index you to a paste, which is just simply a bunch of data that's been dumped on the ClearNet. And in those pastes, sometimes you can see if there's phone number information. Sometimes you can see if there's addresses and the like, more data just outside of your own email. But I think, wasn't there a marketing firm who had been compromised, and they said close to 1 billion Americans' information, everything from address to social security numbers were...
Yeah, it wasn't just Americans,
Yeah.
but yes, everyone that they touched were now, that data was out and compromised. I can tell you this, Alex Riles, our VP, actually just did a demonstration, and the demonstration was this. We randomly bumped into a person on the street. We never had an encounter with them. We never talked to them. We didn't do anything. But their phone disclosed to us, using a tool, all the things that they connect to. And we, based on that, we went to a database that says, where are these things in the US? And we were able to understand every single thing about that person, their job, who their boss was, what they'd like to do. We had pictures of their house. We had pictures of the floor plan of their house. All of that data was available because of all of these, both the commercial database, but also all of the disclosure that's been going on. So quite literally, you could never even meet the people that are coming directly after you and know everything about you, because that's how bad we are at protecting our private data.
And the question probably raising in your minds is, ooh, that's very scary. Is there any such thing as privacy anymore, and everything like that? And there's a lot of philosophical discussions and debates of if we as people even have privacy, if that's something we can hold on to and keep. I think there are measures we can take to remain private, but ultimately when you're giving your data out, whether it's willingly or not willingly because it's required in the case of gaining access to healthcare or whatever, just be aware and monitor yourself. So look at your credit reports regularly, see if there are inquiries being made, limit inquiries where you can. Limit the data that is shared about you. What most people forget is when they just sign a piece of paper, they don't realize that there are aspects in which they can limit the data that's shared about you. This comes down to the old aspect of, do we read the terms and conditions before we even sign? So just starting to be aware of what's out, what's going on, what happens, spending more time than you might like to limit the type of information that's shared, all can ultimately benefit you in the end.
One of the things we do right now is recommend to people that if you're an employer, you should hire out privacy protection services for your employees. And you might say, oh, that's just a perk, or that is an investment in your own security, because it really only takes compromising one employee, and now they have the ability to get onto your network through that compromised employee. So if you spend a little bit of money protecting them and their own identity and their data, you're probably going to benefit directly yourself in your organization. So when you're talking to your partners, you could say one of the easiest and least expensive investments you could be making right now is to protect your employees from identity theft and other forms of breaches. And that minor thing not only is a good perk for their employees, but is also something that is directly protecting you and your business.
All right, we could go on and on. This is really great dialogue, great question. Sam, thanks for asking that. And so we just need to wrap this up because we went over time, but this was really good dialogue. Appreciate everyone that was on the call. Thanks, Brett and Josh, again, and look forward to next month's call. Take care, everybody.